Hi, welcome back. Welcome to my little channel where I talk about nautical history, nautical fiction sometimes, Irish history sometimes, and sometimes some general interest stuff. I'm still working on my top 10 submarine movies video, but this time we're talking about convoy HX-84. In the Battle of the Atlantic, in the early days of the Battle of the Atlantic, the battle that Churchill said he worried most about, things were different to what happened later on. Britain was very short of escorts. Submarines didn't go past 20 degrees west, German U-boats. So Britain was reliant, especially for the first half of the convoy, on old American destroyers, what they call the town class destroyers, four stackers, and armed merchant cruisers, AMCs. And these were merchant vessels that had been co-opted into the Royal Navy and had a mixture of crew of Royal Naval crew, both hostilities only crew and veteran professional Royal Navy men. And in many cases, the crew who'd been with that merchant vessel beforehand stayed on and were co-opted into the Royal Naval Reserve. This particular convoy we're talking about, HX-84, it was leaving Halifax, bound for the UK. It had one escort, armed merchant cruiser Jervis Bay, and she was waiting for destroyers, some town-class destroyers, those old four-stackers that from the World War I era that the US had given to Britain, that they never turned up. So the convoy set off with sole escort, expecting to be met when they got to about 20 degrees west. They would be met by escort vessels that would shepherd them through U-boat waters. Until then, it was regarded as sufficient to just have her under the guard of Jervis Bay. Now, Jervis Bay was a vessel that had been plying its trade between the UK and Australia. It was mixed cargo and passenger ship. It would take outgoing emigrant passengers from the UK to Australia and come back with foodstuffs and things from Australia to Britain before the war. A lot of the crew stayed on when she became an armed merchant cruiser. She was fitted with 7 6-inch guns and a few smaller anti-aircraft guns. That was the sum total of her armament. Armed merchant cruisers were intended really to roam the seas on their own and stop German vessels at sea, blockade runners as they would have been called, trying to get to Germany from the Atlantic, around the British Isles, that kind of thing. So they were also used for escort duties as well. Not really intended to be used on their own, but in this case that's what happened. Jervis Bay was called after Jervis Bay in Australia. It's spelt Jervis, but pronounced Jarvis in most cases. Apparently it was a bone of contention in Australia back in the 60s anyway. I don't know about now.
The issue is simple. Is it pronounced Jervis, as the spelling indicates, or Jarvis, as most widely used by other media in Australia? Do you say Jervis or Jarvis?
Oh, well, I better watch what I see. I'll be on television tonight. We see Jervis.
Jarvis.
Yeah, Jervis.
Jarvis.
Jarvis Bay.
Jarvis Bay, yes.
Yeah.
How do you pronounce that street?
I'd say Jarvis Street.
You sure?
Yes, I'm pretty sure now.
You people say Jarvis or Jervis?
Jervis. Spelt with an E, say Jervis.
What do you say?
I say Jervis.
You will find Jervis Bay is called after Admiral Jervis, John Jervis, who was a very famous admiral back in the Napoleonic days. He became known as St. Vincent after he was awarded a title, and his own life story is quite interesting. I believe you will find an old BBC pronunciation guide that suggests his family pronounced the name Jervis, but generally I think in the UK it's pronounced Jarvis, like Barclay or Derby. And I heard it first as Jervis Bay from my dad, so I'm going to stick with that, Jervis Bay. The convoy had 39 vessels, had over 200,000 tons of goods on board, ranging from pit props to fighter planes. Everything that Britain needed to stay alive had to come across the Atlantic. Everything Britain needed to fight the war, both men and materiel, had to come across the Atlantic. And later days, the Soviet Union needed the same support. So the Atlantic convoys were critical. As I said, this was the early days. Now, Jervis Bay was commanded by Edward Fagan, F-E-G-E-N. Fagan was third generation Royal Navy, an Irish family. He was born in Hampshire, but regarded as Irish by many, it seems, including Churchill, who listed him in the list of Irish war heroes at the end of World War II. The crew, as I said, was very mixed. If you saw my top 10 nautical fiction list, you might have seen me refer to a book by Douglas Reman called Rendezvous South Atlantic, and that is a novel. Douglas Reman did serve in World War II, so he knows what he's talking about, and that novel is about an armed merchant cruiser, and was probably inspired by these events we're talking about, and it gives a very good picture of what it was like for the mix of those different types of people trying to gel into a team. But kind of unique setup. The Germans did similar. The Germans had armed merchant cruisers as well. The whole idea of the merchant cruisers, the whole idea of cruising and cruising rules developed when countries were trying to put some kind of shape on what was allowed and not allowed at sea in wartime, and how navies could interfere with merchant vessels. And basically the idea was that ships would stop a vessel if they didn't like what it was carrying, where it was going, thought it had contraband, thought it might be aiding the enemy, they could sink it or take it. And a lot of the times early in the war, even U-boats would do things like surface, fire a warning shot, allow people to get off, and then sink the ship, and then approach the lifeboats, tell them where the nearest land was if they were unsure of their location, and if they needed medical supplies, give them some. And it was fairly civilized in lots of cases. Of course, that all eroded a little as the war went on, and certainly in the Pacific it wasn't as friendly at all. But merchant cruisers were generally going to be cruising and looking for enemy shipping, not really meant to go up against enemy capital ships. What happened was with this ship was the convoy was steaming along, then out of the blue a ship appeared on the horizon, and it was the German raider Admiral Shear. The Admiral Shear was a pocket battleship. She had two sister ships, the Deutschland, soon to be changed to the Lutzow, and the Admiral Graf Spee, which roamed the South Atlantic. These ships were built in breach of the Versailles Treaty terms. Germany was supposed to be limited to ships 10,000 in size, 10,000 tons, and 11-inch guns. These were more like 12, 13,000, and they had 11-inch guns, 3 in each turret. They had they were designed to be big enough and powerful enough to destroy anything that could keep up with them, anything that fast. And they were fast enough to get away from any of the heavy battleships that they couldn't stand up to. So they were called pocket battleships. What happened was the plane spotted the convoy, returned to the Shear, didn't radio it, kept radio silence, got to the Shear, was picked up and was able to report the convoy's location. Soon the convoy saw the tower of a major ship on the horizon. Initially, it was identified as a British ship. Jervis Bay moved towards it, flashing the interrogation signal MAG. Nothing happened, and then this other ship flashed back MAG itself. It was just a ruse to buy time. Then it opened fire on the Jervis Bay. Jervis Bay immediately told the convoy to scatter, and she began to prepare her weapons, but she had a range of 10,000 yards. The Admiral Shear had a range of 25,000 yards. First salvo missed on one side. The second salvo missed on the other side. Everybody on board knew what was going to happen the third salvo. And yes, the third salvo smashed into the ship, hitting the bridge, wounding the captain, starting fires. The ship kept going, kept firing at the Shear. The convoy was scattering. The ships were all going in different directions in a prearranged plan. There was a rendezvous they were to make if they had to scatter, but the plan was they would all go different directions, and that's what they were doing, narrowly avoiding collisions and everything. The Jervis Bay kept going towards the Shear as the shells were landing on her. The German gunnery was very good. They couldn't get near her with their own shells. She was actually doing more damage to herself with the concussion of her own guns. Were damaging their own seaplane. There were some door left open was allowing damage to be done inside the ship. There was a lot of damage being done to the Jervis Bay. Obviously, she was being torn apart. Any gun that could keep firing kept firing. Eventually, she stopped dead in the water, aflame from stem to stern. The captain was dead. About 200 men died, and a couple of dozen were able to get off and were picked up later. The convoy had gone in separate ways. Shear spent the rest of that day and night tracking down ships of the convoy, sinking some, damaging others, and if it hadn't been for Jervis Bay's sacrifice, she would have just waded into the convoy and probably destroyed them all. Now, you have to ask yourself about the wisdom or the bravery or the foolhardiness of this, but in fairness to everybody on board the Jervis Bay, not that everybody had a choice, but they did buy time for the convoy. There was another ship. I was looking around trying to find any other ship on the other side, a German or Japanese ship that faced a similar situation. And while there was great bravery on the part of Japanese ships in impossible situations, there wasn't a situation I found. I didn't look too hard. There wasn't a situation that I found where there was a single ship going up against overwhelming odds. On the German side, the Graf Spee was an interesting case. The Graf Spee, the other German pocket battleship, she was in the South Atlantic. She was preying on British merchant shipping, Allied merchant shipping, fairly humanely, it must be said, taking the crews prisoner, treating them reasonably well, and sinking the ships after they got the crews off. She encountered 3 British cruisers, Exeter, Achilles, and Ajax. Exeter was a heavy cruiser, the other 2 were light cruisers, and they harried her and damaged her, and she went into the neutral port of Montevideo looking to get repaired. She was allowed 72 hours in a neutral port, otherwise she'd have been interned. After 72 hours, knowing that the 3 British ships were out there and led to believe that there were heavier units out there as well, Captain Langsdorff of the Graf Spee took her out, and then to everybody's surprise, in the estuary, he scuttled the ship, took a skeleton crew off, and 2 days later, in the hotel room in Buenos Aires, he laid out his battle flag on the floor of his hotel room, lay on it and shot himself. His crew survived, 2,000 men, basically. They stayed in Uruguay and Argentina, and a lot of them settled there after the war, and their kids are there still. Had he gone out and fought against the 3 ships, he probably would have lost all those men. So, did he do the right thing? In Germany, they're a bit conflicted apparently about how to regard him. Had he moral courage doing what he did? It's hard to imagine a Royal Navy captain doing that. But in the Jervis Bay case, they had a convoy to protect, and they went and they sacrificed themselves to save the convoy, to try and save the convoy. They did a lot of good, obviously. A lot more ships of that convoy would have been lost. There was a case, though, of another ship, the Rawalpindi. Rawalpindi was another armed merchant cruiser with 6-inch guns, and she was basically sailing along near the south of the Faroe Islands, and she encountered 2 German cruisers, the Scharnhorst and the Gneisenau, and she made smoke and tried to run, but they had asked her to surrender. She didn't, and they fired at her, and she fired uselessly at them, scored one hit on the Scharnhorst, and then basically the Rawalpindi was destroyed. Again, a flame, stem to stern, captain dead, 200 or so people killed. A lot of men lost their lives horribly. A lot of children lost their father. A lot of wives lost their husband. A lot of parents lost their son. About 40 or 50 survived, something like that. Again, different sources will give you different figures. The captain, by the way, of the Rawalpindi, his name was Kennedy. Edward Kennedy, I think it was. He had been a retired naval officer, brought back for the war, and I suppose you could say he could have surrendered, but at that stage of the war, Britain was standing alone against the Germans. It's hard to imagine Royal Navy officer, captain, surrendering to the Germans, but he wasn't saving any convoy. He was basically trying to get away. Captain Fagan won a VC for steaming towards the German ships, allowing the convoy to escape. Captain Kennedy was mentioned in dispatches. I guess what he was doing wasn't quite as brave, I suppose, in somebody's estimation. Captain Kennedy had a son in the Navy at the time who was 20 years old. His name was Ludwig Kennedy. You probably know him as the famous writer and broadcaster. Now, there's one other ship well worth talking about here in that convoy, HX-84. And the ship is called the San Demetrio. She also passed into legend along with Jervis Bay. San Demetrio was a tanker carrying 14,000 tons of high octane aircraft fuel from Aruba. She had sailed from Aruba to Halifax, joined the convoy, and she was a British ship, crew, a lot of Scots on board, a Yank, and some Englishmen, and basically she was, I think, the third or fourth ship that the Shear opened fire on. She was a floating time bomb, really, with all that fuel. She took a few hits. One lookout was killed instantly of the first shell. Fire started. Captain said abandon ship. Had a prearranged signal with the engine room people that if you rang the engines on the telegraph to say finished with engines, it meant abandon ship. So they abandoned ship into 3 lifeboats. Captain and some men went in one lifeboat. The rest of the crew was split between two other lifeboats. The crew with the chief engineer, the lifeboat with the chief engineer and the second officer, and some men found themselves floating later, 2 or 3 days later, found themselves floating, and there was this burning hulk of a ship nearby. And they approached and they realised it was their own ship, San Demetrio, still afloat, burning. Surrounded by a sea of petrol on the leeward side, so they couldn't approach. They were badly seasick. Some of the men on board were hurt from falling into the lifeboat as they got off. They felt they might be better off on the ship than in the lifeboat because the weather was getting up. They were very worried about causing a spark, so they waited till the next day. And the ship was still nearby and the weather was getting worse. So they basically finally approached and they wrapped the gunnels of the lifeboat in blankets so they wouldn't set off a spark touching against the side of the ship, because basically the ship was surrounded by petrol. They climbed aboard. They tried to haul the lifeboat up out of the water and left it hanging half suspended. It ended up getting smashed, so they were stuck on board. What these men found when they got on the San Demetrio was the ship in a very bad way. There were fires all over the place, small fires, big fires, smouldering fires. There was fuel spurting out through holes in the decks and every roll and flowing into the lee scuppers. They were shitting themselves basically. It could go at any minute. They divided themselves into 2 crews. One crew was on the deck trying to put out the fires using a bucket brigade, basically, using water. The other crew went into the engine room. They wanted to see what they could do about getting some power, some electrical power for the, for the pumps, for the fire pumps, and also to see what they could do about getting the engines going if possible, or getting. They need to get power for the fuel pumps to even try and start the engines or do any work on the engines. But the engine room was partially flooded and there was a lot of damage there. There was a thing called a Paxman generator they had on board. And the Paxman generator was for degaussing. If the ship was ever to get into an area where there was mines, to prevent magnetic mines being activated, they would need to degauss the ship periodically to remove the ship's magnetism. I don't know the details of the science, you can look it up. But this Paxman generator was basically like a standalone generator power source that they would use for this degaussing. Unfortunately, they were going through an area with no mines, so when the convoy was hit, this Paxman generator had been dismantled for servicing, so they had to reassemble this generator and get it working, and they did. But then they found, to their horror, that an awful lot of the cables were damaged, so they had to reinstate all the cables. They were able to get the fire pumps going. They were able to get the fires under control. They were able to hammer pegs, wooden pegs, into a lot of the holes from the shrapnel from the shells where fuel was leaking out. They were using waste cotton to jam other holes. Still lots of fuel everywhere. There was they had a meat locker with a cork, basic cork insulation. That insulation was smouldering. They had to rip it apart. They had to tear it apart to get at that. Fire had spread through that cork insulation, and they couldn't relax until they had that dealt with. Looking for food, they couldn't find any food. They found some meat. The meat they took, it was all tainted from the firefighting fluids and that had been used. So those who ate the meat were very, very sick. They had one sick lad with them. Some of the men had been hurt falling into the lifeboat when they abandoned ship. And one of those guys, his condition was deteriorating rapidly. They put him in, as they worked on the engines and started to get the engines going, they were able to prop him up in the engine room because he was the greaser, they called him, the engine room apprentice, a young lad. He was able to sit in the location where he could keep an eye on the gauges and tell them about anything that was overheating. But he was slowly dying. They came up with a scheme whereby they got the engines. They finally got the engines after a lot of work. Got the engines going. They had no steering. They had steering of a type. They had a secondary steering position where the wheel was still kind of intact. They had a few spokes and a bit of a rim, but the shafts that ran from the steering to the steering gear ran through bulkheads that had all been buckled. So they had to hammer these bulkheads straight so that the shafts could pass through them. To be able to control the engines, they had to rig 3 lights, and they were short cable, but the lights were quite high in the engine room. So if they wanted to give a message to the engineer, they had to hammer on a hatch so the engineer would know, and then he'd look at the lights and they'd turn on a light forward, back, or forward, after, midships, to say go forward, go stern, or stop, using these 3 lights. And that was how they controlled it. They found the compass 2 floors below where the bridge had been. They thought it would work, but they fixed it up near the steering position. But when the ship was veering, they realised the compass wasn't moving and it wasn't working at all. They thought it had potential, but they ended up steering by the stars when they did manage to see them, or by guessing from the brightness through the cloudy sky where the sun was rising or setting, and they headed east. Eventually ended up in Blacksod Bay in Ireland. They were in the bay, they were trying to signal, see if anybody ashore would take notice of them, when a tug turned up, British tug that had been plying up and down the west coast, I think, looking for survivors of the convoys, and shortly afterwards they were joined by HMS Arrow, a British destroyer that was carrying shipwrecked sailors from another merchant vessel, some of whom volunteered to go on the San Demetrio, and they helped to get the San Demetrio into the Clyde. By the way, they could do 9 knots when they got going, so they weren't that slow. They were able to get around into the Clyde, and when they came in, a lot of their fuel was still aboard. A lot of their cargo that was still there, so it was well worth them bringing this ship in, because the men who did it got salvage rights, and they got about £1,000 each, which was something. There's books about this. As I said, there's the fictionalized story based on our merchant cruisers Rendezvous South Atlantic, which I highly recommend. There's a movie made about the San Demetrio called San Demetrio London, old black and white, made during the war as sort of a propaganda boost, shot in the arm. But there's an old book by one of the survivors of the San Demetrio, a fella called Colin McNeil, Scots lad. There was a lot of Scottish on board. That book's an interesting read, because not only does he talk about the events, he actually gives you a bit of an insight into what it was to be a merchant seaman in those days. San Demetrio. And there's a recent book about that convoy and the Jervis Bay. Convoy will scatter. Bernard Edwards was a sea captain who, when he gave up the sea, did a lot of stuff on naval history. I came across a couple of errors in this. Could have done with a better editor, I think. And he does talk about another ship called the Beaverford that allegedly fought on against the Admiral Shear and occupied her for quite a while, allowing more ships to escape. But that seems to be a bit fanciful. The Shear doesn't mention that in her logs, and nobody survived from the Beaverford, and it's unclear where he's getting his information. So there you are. I hope you enjoyed this story of some brave ships companies. Brave ships. Do ships have characters? They don't really, do they? Of course they do. But it's more the ships companies. See you now. Take care. Mind yourselves.